Okay, everyone, welcome to lecture number 2 of the bioethics section of the synbio lecture series. This is Bioethics in Action, and it will be taught again by me, Este, and we're really going to be discussing everything to do with bioethics in the real world and synthetic biology. So let's get started. Bioethics and synthetic biology. As we start talking about how to incorporate bioethics in a synthetic biology project, we definitely need to talk about the timing of it all, because timing is incredibly important when you want to start thinking about the ethics, and you definitely want to start thinking about the ethics of your project at the beginning. There are a number of reasons for that. The first of which would be that it encourages planning and anticipates problems. And it also prevents future stoppages due to ethical issues. So these are pretty straightforward. Just the idea that if you're going to have problems, you're going to be thinking about them at the very beginning. So you're going to be planning, you're going to be anticipating any issues you might run into. And of course, it will, in turn, this planning will prevent any unnecessary stoppages that you may have to had made later on, but you've thought about them ahead of time. It also encourages constant self-reflection, which is incredibly important. Ethics is really about self-reflection and reflection in general, and you want to give yourself the space to do that. As well, you want to encourage it and encourage everyone in your project to be doing it from the beginning. So if you start talking about the real world issues of your project at the very beginning, then you're going to be more inclined to be constantly thinking about it and to be reevaluating it throughout. And then finally, kind of similar to the first three, it allows space for mistakes and problem solving early on. It's kind of a similar thing in that, would you rather realize that you have a huge ethical issue at the start of a project or later on? And the earlier you start thinking about this, the easier it is going to be to solve problems, and the easier it's going to be to solve mistakes that you may have made, or to go back and fix things before anything is too late. So if the research of your project is such that you run into a really serious problem early on, and you realize this early on, then you will be able to hopefully fix that early on and not run into that problem later where it will be much more difficult to fix. Now that we've talked a bit about when to incorporate bioethics, we can talk a little bit more about how to incorporate ethics in your design. And there are a few things that you'd want to consider. You want to consider the essential ethical questions at the very start. So that would be before any lab or field work. You want to be in wherever you are thinking about what project you're doing. You also want to be actively thinking about what it's going to be used for, which of course you probably are, as well as what issues may come out of that. So anytime that you're thinking about what your project might be used for, you absolutely want to be thinking about the ethics, and even before then. And then second, you want to begin more intensive research during your project development. So as you're starting the more intensive project development, you want to be doing more research about your stakeholders. You want to be doing more research about possible scenarios, maybe things that are similar that have been done before. Basically, as the project basically as the project starts to project, oh my gosh. So you even want to be thinking about the ethics of your project when you're formulating your research question. And this is important for the reasons we listed before, just basically in that you're always going to be thinking about your ethics. And even when you've started thinking about what you're going to be doing for your project, you're still considering the ethics of it, and that will affect in turn how you create your project from the start, and it will just make everything easier later on, kind of like we discussed in the previous slide. But when you're formulating your research question, you definitely want to think about a few things in terms of the ethics of it. So, of course, who or what will be affected positively or negatively by your project. So who being the stakeholders, of course, and in which ways they're going to be affected. And you want to be well aware, as much as you can be, that whatever you're working on and how whatever you're working on will affect anyone else. And then, of course, we have how the project will affect them. So, is it going to be a benefit or a harm? Is that, as we discussed before, is it going to be a negative or a positive? So will something be added to their lives or to the situation, or will something be taken away? You want to know all of these because it's going to make it a lot easier later on, or in the beginning, knowing if you're able to, for example, mitigate any harms or encourage any benefits. And then finally, number 3 is, when will this effect take place and how impactful will it be? And this is an important one that we haven't really discussed, but you of course want to know when the effect, or any effect, if there will be, will take place and the impact that it will have. And when is important because you want to have an idea. It's a big difference if the impact is going to be taking place immediately or if it's going to be in 10 years. Or if you think about something like climate change, which is often an issue that is discussed, is whether or not the effects will, does it matter that the effects are not happening necessarily right now, but that certain worse impacts will happen in 50 years or 20 years. So does the timing matter? And of course, how impactful will it be? That's pretty straightforward. So we'll just go a little bit deeper into these, not too much, but like I said before, we're thinking about who's going to be affected first. You must know your stakeholders. This is essential. You must know the people, the things, whatever is going to be impacted by what you're doing. So at the very beginning, when you're thinking about your research question, you are thinking about the end product, who is going to be affected. And this, of course, will impact things like religion, people in minority groups, people with disabilities, animals, the environment, all these different things that you need to be considering. You need to be thinking about, well, how might it affect, even if you're not sure that it will, especially, for example, with something like religion, which will often have have an opinion or a particular thought, or might be affected. People who are religious might be affected by certain projects or by certain policy changes. Or even something in a hospital, when the discussion about taking a patient off life support is being talked about. Religion often plays a role in that. People often have issues with taking someone off life support due to religious beliefs. And this is all something that you're going to be considering, especially in a scientific project in synthetic biology. You need to be considering at the very beginning how these projects might be impacted later on by something like religion, or by minority groups being affected, or by people with disabilities and everything like that. And for the how they will be impacted, well, is this going to be a direct or indirect impact? And these things matter, because if you are going to be, let's say, instituting a policy that let's think about the Canadian government legalizing weed. All right, there's a difference between the impact directly to perhaps the average Canadian citizen, who maybe can have more direct access to weed, but there is a difference between that and then perhaps the issue of children having impact. Well, our children having an impact where people may be concerned that children may have easier access to weed and perhaps other drugs if it is legalized. So while weed may not be legalized for children, an indirect impact could be the easier access potentially for children to weed. And whether this actually happened, I'm not sure. I have not done the research. And what is more likely to occur? Is the direct impact more likely to occur? Is the indirect impact likely to occur? The likelihood matters, okay? We're not just throwing out risks and saying they're all equal, because they're not all equal. Some impacts will be felt more intensely than others. And so these things matter. The intensity of the impact, it matters for how much of a risk you should be willing to take. And then finally, like we talked about before, when will any of these effects occur? So will it happen immediately or in the future, 5, 10, 100 years? These things matter, of course. If people sometimes get caught up in issues of, well, it's 100 years from now, so it doesn't matter. But there's certainly an argument to be made for the for responsibility that we have to help people of the future and protect our future generations. And then finally, does the timing of the benefit does the timing impact the benefit or the harm that is resulted? So does the timing of the impact, or the timing of the benefit or harm that is happening impact what kind of benefit or harm will result? So, and that can often happen, maybe a benefit or a harm or whatever is happening, whatever effect is multiplied when it happens later on. It's not necessarily due to the time, but just for whatever reason, or maybe it is far lessened. The impact is far lessened than what is happening later on. So for example, with something like climate change, the timing does have an impact, because the more we wait, and in the years to come, the benefit is going to be far, far worse than if we dealt with it right now, than if we're putting it off to deal with something like climate change later on. Now I'd like to do a little bit of an exercise with you with some of the work that we've done earlier. I'll read this out and then we'll talk about it. So the iGEM 2017 Toronto team focused on using a novel light-activated gene regulation system that combines the DNA binding region of LACI with the light-inducible LOVE, light oxygen voltage domain. With more widespread and accessible use of CRISPR-Cas9, a current and important concern is the impacts that this will have on society. A topical issue on this subject is human genome editing. The 2017 Human Practices team examined the impact of human genome editing on important stakeholders worldwide. So using the skills that you've learned up until this point, how might you implement bioethical principles and thinking to this project? You should list some different stakeholders, explaining why and how they are impacted, and come up with some solutions to the problems that have been presented. Think about if the solutions are feasible and why or why not. And we will go over some answers to this. Take a few minutes, pause the video, and we'll go over a couple of options that could have been considered. So here are a few answers that could have been considered. The first set of stakeholders we could have talked about are people with disabilities. So the possibility here would be eradicating certain disabilities, more specifically trisomy 21 or Down syndrome, which has been something that has been topic of conversation for a while with things like human genome editing. And this is a big issue, and this is some of the work that was done during the 2017 iGEM project, where we interviewed people with disabilities and disability advocates. And so the issues here are that it views people with disabilities as unimportant or undesirable or not ideal members of society, not people that we would want in our society. And that's not obviously something that we want, because people with disabilities can thrive and do thrive every day. People with Down syndrome live very full lives and can live very happy lives, and often do, especially now. So this is something that would require a serious rethinking, either figuring out a way of how to change how we view disability, either in the way that it's presented through how we implement genome editing, or trying to change our culture around disability, which is not at all easy. Or serious rethinking would have to be done in how we intend to implement access to the technology. So how much choice will parents have when they're when they're pregnant and they're trying to, will they be allowed to, for example, if they see that their that the unborn child has Down syndrome or might have Down syndrome. Will they be allowed to change that? Where will the limits be? And these are things that would need to be considered. And then another option here would be people with life-threatening genetic diseases would absolutely be stakeholders in this scenario. So these are people who who could have something like Huntington's disease or something where it is life-threatening. You are very likely to die from that disease, and it is a genetic disease. So this would absolutely affect people's ability, our ability to help people who are born with these diseases who often have no other options. An issue here, though, is who's going to have access. How much will it cost? Will cost play a factor? How much will it cost to give people access to this technology? Initially, something that could be very, very expensive. And how is this going to be shared among jurisdictions, countries? How is the cost going to be implemented into our healthcare systems? There are ways to kind of consider this initially and to consider how the program will be costed, or ways to possibly limit direct costs to patients. And this is, of course, a very complex issue and not something that I would expect us to figure out here. But again, just things to be considering when you are starting your project. So definitely cost is something that will often play a factor in especially things like elective surgeries or something like this. We, of course, want to be, like we talked about a little bit before, considering and making ethical checks throughout your project. You need checkups throughout the project because you may forget, or you may not have noticed that some issues may have changed, or some aspects of your project may have changed and may be affecting stakeholders in a way that you didn't anticipate, or may be likely to do so. So these are things you must be checking throughout your project. So how is this something that you go about doing? Well, you need to reassess your ethical landscape as your project progresses. So reassess what is going on. Think about it, start from scratch. Think about what you are doing currently in your project, where that is taking you, and where that is likely going to lead in a final outcome. So this is something that you should be constantly thinking about throughout your project. And then you also want to be considering evolving scenarios that may impact your stakeholders. So scenarios that may not be in your control, but may be changing and may impact your final product or the final impact on your stakeholders. Something that you might not be able to control, but you should still be aware of, because you can't necessarily control every issue that you may run across. And you certainly won't be able to control every issue. But it is important that you make yourself aware of as many as possible, that you make others aware as well, so everyone knows and what is going on. And ethical checks can be introduced to a project that is already started. And so that being that you can start thinking about the ethics throughout your project. It's just not ideal. It's not the best scenario, but there are ways to be considering your ethics as your project has already started, and often that is what is done currently. It is not something that we want to be focused on. We don't want to be focused on only starting ethical checks or considering issues as the project's already started. But if it is something that you're going to be doing, then you want to start by immediately communicating with stakeholders and relevant parties. So no matter when you've started, if it is in the middle of your project, you want to be immediately communicating with the stakeholders. This is very important because these are the people who you likely have not been either considering or have not been worked on throughout the project. So you need to be communicating with them right away. And then you need to be considering the ethical issues that already have arisen or will arise. So this is kind of like we talked about a little bit before, but you've added on the ones that may have already come up, because ethical issues often do come up even in the beginning of a project. So you'll be considering both the ones that may come up and the ones that already have that you may have to do damage control for. And then you need to be willing to work backwards in order to square your project ethically before you can have it ready for public use. So if you've started a project and you realize that something in the methodology of it is impacting stakeholders or issues in a way that is not okay and really needs to be fixed, you have to be willing to take a step, take a pause, and work backwards, and possibly even change aspects of your project in a non-linear fashion in order to make it something feasible for, in order to make it something where the issues could be solved and where the issues are incredibly important. So we'll think back to the example of the iGEM 2017 project, the iGEM Toronto 2017 project, and imagine that a final project has been produced and is ready for widespread use. How might you work to ensure that all the relevant ethical considerations are made, even though the project is nearly complete? This isn't something that we'll go deeply into now. I'll just kind of explain to you what the iGEM team did do, and even though we didn't have, of course, a complete project that was going to be put out into the public, we still did what we could to kind of have in-progress checks. So we created a video series interviewing important stakeholders and representatives in relevant fields. So we did this to create a record of important voices on the topic for future use and reference. Essentially, we were videotaping, interviewing doctors, religious authorities, disability advocates, people who were relevant to the field and who had something to say that was important. And we filmed them, we put them online, we made them subtitled, and we worked our best to try and make them informative for future research done on human genome editing. Communicating bioethics is a very important topic, and I know Umar will be talking about it as well, so I'll dive into a little bit of some of it, and he'll probably be continuing a little bit more on this later on. But there are two general groups that are involved when you're trying to communicate bioethics. So that's going to be the general public, which would include people like your stakeholders, and of course scientists and researchers, probably like you, the people listening right now. So communicating bioethics can take many forms. You could do it in the form of a report or an analysis. You could do it in policy proposals and grants, web pages, places to get info like government sites, scientific sites for the public. You could do it in campaigns. So for example, I generally think of the campaign by the government of safety in weed use and marijuana. Then I also think now when I'm recording these from my bedroom for stay home and social distancing. There have been not necessarily campaigns, but kind of hashtags promoted by the government to get people to stay home or make staying home stay cool. All these different ways that they have been trying to communicate to the public that it's incredibly important to stay home. So communicating bioethics to the public is definitely an important aspect and something that you should really get to know. There are a few important considerations that one needs to make when communicating bioethics to the public. First is that of truthfulness. So whatever you're communicating, you've got to be truthful. It has to be unbiased, unmanipulated results, or the opinions of the ethics report. So it needs to be something that just true. It's as simple as that. Just true information and unbiased and unmanipulated. And second is clarity. So along with truthfulness it needs to be in simple language that makes sense, using examples that make sense to the general public. So layman's terms, not terms that only you are familiar with. And this is true of scientists communicating to the public too, that you need to be able to speak clearly or write clearly, and any data is reported clearly. And then finally is accessibility. Super important. Basically, the distribution of information, it respects all abilities. The information is free and it is offered to the public easily. It's easily accessible. So, for example, the videos that we made for the 2017 iGEM Toronto team, they were subtitled and they were free and they were easily accessible. Of course, that was just a small project we had worked on, but the same goes for any project that you are working on, and that the results and the information needs to be needs to be accessible, and it needs to respect people of all abilities. Absolutely, especially in something like the reason that we were so focused on accessibility is that a lot of the people that we were talking to are affected by certain disabilities. So you especially need to consider if your stakeholders have certain limitations in their abilities, and take that into consideration when you're disseminating information. A little bit more on accessibility, that the information, of course, is free, clearly advertised, and requires basically little to no effort to obtain. It has to take into consideration stakeholders, like we said before, and especially when choosing how the information is presented. So are you going to have subtitles in a video that you're making, or are you just writing a report? Are you having visual descriptions of pictures and videos? Are there transcripts if there's only audio available? It's all these different little things that you need to consider when you're trying to make the information accessible to the public. And the language, of course, like we said before, non-scientific language. This goes into clarity as well, like we talked about. But again, into accessibility too, because often English is not the first language for many people. So to use complex language, even and if it's not scientific language, but just complex English, may be difficult for many people. So you need to take that into consideration when you're, for example, recruiting people for studies, or when you are trying to explain things to people. It needs to be in language that everyone would be able to comprehend. Communication between bioethicists and scientists and healthcare workers, people in health, is incredibly important because, of course, in bioethics, so much of it is working with scientists and working with healthcare providers, especially if you're in a clinical or research area. So you really need to have a mutual understanding and respect for both fields, for how ethicists reason and come to conclusions, and for how scientists and healthcare workers reason and come to conclusions. It's a very different process often for these different areas, and you need to be able to communicate effectively. If you are not working in both of these fields, you need to develop some kind of understanding and respect for what the other is doing. And you need to be able to, of course, explain your reasoning clearly and show why you came to certain conclusions. This is incredibly important because you need to be able to not only explain this for yourself, but for those who you're trying to, or who you want to justify your conclusions to, and who you want to explain these clearly to, so they're fully accepted. Or if not accepted, they are understood by those you're trying to communicate with. And because there's often different reasoning and different conclusions reached by healthcare workers and scientists and people in medical fields and bioethicists, it's important that when you have that respect, you're then able to understand how each person sees the situation, and you're more likely to have better outcomes and more understanding outcomes if we work this way. Having an ethical analysis is incredibly important, and having kind of last review of everything is also going to be incredibly important. There needs to be some kind of review or analysis that comes out of your project, something that will distill all of the setbacks and the improvements that you've made throughout the project, all of the issues that you may have run into, what your recommendations are going to be, and what might happen based on those recommendations, and what the current facts of the situation are. This may seem self-evident, but these are incredibly important. It's incredibly important to have something like this so that you can look at everything you've done, see where you currently stand and see where it can take you in the future, or it could take someone else, because this will also be incredibly important for anyone else who continues to work on the same topic or on a similar project. They will have all of this information available to them to go back to and to review, and to have this foundation laid out by you at the beginning of a particular subject. While there isn't any set rules or structures or considerations necessarily of how this can be done, it's something that we can use considerations that will be made based on the principles of bioethics that we've discussed and all the previous learning. We can set down some pretty straightforward ideas of how you can do an ethical analysis review. So the first couple here will be, what is the issue or the question? So of course, kind of similar to what we talked about before, this will be a little bit of a review here with some more added info. So what's the issue in question? What are the facts, like we talked about before? What are the possible actions available? What can be done? And what benefits or harms might arise from any of these actions? So what is going to happen from what you choose to do, from what the project is going to do, from what your many options are? And of course, what are the stakeholders, and why are they stakeholders, and how many are there? And of course, then which action or option is going to be the best option and why? And something that is so important here is that I want to stress this, you do need to have something that you've chosen as the best option. Something that people kind of mistake in bioethics and philosophy in general is that, there are no answers, there's only questions. Well, in bioethics and applied ethics, there are answers. You have to have answers. And while we talked about at the beginning, there might not be the right answer, there will be the best answer. Because ultimately, if you come out of a project and you say, well, we looked at this, this is bad, this option is bad, but this one's also bad, or this one's good, but this one's also good. So, we can't really figure it out. It could be bad or good. That's not doing bioethical reasoning. And by now, I hope you understand that. What is important is that you, through logic and reasoning, come up with the best option available, and you give reasoning for that. And then, of course, objections. Objections are so important because people are going to come up with opposing arguments, and you have to be ready to combat those, or possibly be ready to take in an argument you hadn't thought of. So what objections may be raised against this action? You want to be thinking about all the possible objections that are reasonable, that might be thought of or raised against what option what path you are choosing, and how can they be dealt with? Are they objections that need to be dealt with? So like I said, sometimes they're not able to be dealt with and you have to just concede that, or sometimes they're not that they're not necessary to be dealt with, but they're not necessarily pressing. So they can be put a little bit on the back burner. Seeking out feedback is so important for any project, especially bioethics, because what you're doing, it's essentially caught up in people's lives, and people are affected by what you were researching and by the projects that you are working on. So any project that does have significant effect on others should actively be seeking out feedback and concerns from those affected parties. So I immediately think of something like pipelines and indigenous land, right? You should be seeking out the opinions and the advice of indigenous communities who are affected by the use of their land. And this can also be done other ways, through surveys, perhaps interviews, group discussions, reaching out directly. There are so many ways, depending on the project that you have or depending on the issue, that you can reach out to the public. It's just a matter of finding those ways to reach out. And again, it needs to be accessible, encouraged, and non-biased. So people should not be coming to you with their issues. If they're coming to you, then if they're coming to you saying with an issue that they have, you should already be one step ahead of them, essentially, and be looking for that feedback and be trying to work on it. And of course, non-biased being that you shouldn't be asking questions that you want to hear the answers to, right? You should, or that you know the answers to already, and you're framing questions in a way that gets the answer that you want to hear. No. You need to be aware of the real situation. So you need to be aware of what the general public thinks and what stakeholders think. And then, of course, any significant issues need to be noted, acted upon if they can be, if it's reasonable, if it makes sense. But if they can't be in that moment or for whatever reason, it should still be taken down. It should still be in some way noted that these are the issues people had and that this is what we tried to do or consider doing or what someone should do in the future, because it's never an issue to be looking into the future. And if you can't perhaps solve it for yourself, you should be noting it, and hopefully someone can be ready in the future to deal with that issue as well.